Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to session 3, day 2 of the BPA's virtual annual conference, Brave New World. We are ecstatic to deliver today an EV event unlike any other we believe you will have participated in before. You will hear from a number of key speakers in our first session that will take us through for approximately an hour. We will ask you then, following a short break, to rejoin us via a different link that should have been sent to you from the team. Please do reach out if you haven't received that. The second session will include 3 fast round speed sessions to encourage you to participate in the disruption discussions. From that, we'll be taking key factors and elements in the challenges and opportunities in the adoption of EV for the whole of the UK. And we'll be wrapping up for a 3/4 session with our expert speakers rejoining us to have a panel discussion, taking away some key findings and actions to lead the BPA and our partners in a revolution for EV as we evolve its adoption. I'd like to welcome Trevor Taylor, Operations Director for Conduent, Matt Weston, MP, Chair of the APPG on Electric Vehicles, and Daniel Brown will be chairing this initial session, and he is our host from the Renewable Energy Association. Over to you. I hope you have a wonderful time.
Thank you, Karen. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Evolve session this afternoon. Pleased to have been asked by the BPA to introduce the session, and I'm delighted that Conduent have been able to support the BPA in the delivery of the annual conference this year. Introduce myself, my name is Trevor Taylor, Operations Director for Conduent Parking Enforcement Solutions in the UK. Responsibility for our back office capabilities and our on-street enforcement services. I've worked in parking enforcement for 20 years with responsibility for a number of outsourced enforcement and back office services. Many in the UK will recognise the brand Spur Insider, which are now part of Conduent. We're a global company with 80,000 strong workforce, providing services across commercial sector and government. Within our government business is our transportation sector, where we have 4 key areas of business. I'll just talk you through those very briefly. Transport solution is where we provide public transport programs, including fare collection, intelligent mobility programs. We have a road use congestion charging business, which is predominantly a free flow solutions using ANPR, camera technology, and user account management systems. And these are used in tolling programs and urban congestion management. We have public safety, which is camera-based technology predominantly for enforcement purposes, red lights, bus lane enforcement, and that's overlaid with video analytics, which can provide a lot of insightful data about movements in public space, and that can be from pedestrians to push cycles, scooters, and any kind of vehicle movement. In our parking and curbside management business, we provide technology integration, back office processing and payment capabilities, and now the provision of on-street enforcement services, which is complemented through the use of data-led intelligence supporting the deployment practices. We've recently merged our public safety and curbside business, such as a level of crossover in client requirements for these services. Our General Manager, Holly Cooper, talks more about our business and our thoughts around innovation in the BPA podcast, Solutions to Tomorrow's Challenges in Mobility and Public Safety. It's worth a listen, as are the other podcasts that BPA have prepared, and I'd recommend people listen to a few of those. Moving on to today's topic of electric vehicles, Conduent working with suppliers, vendors, government agencies and vehicle manufacturers looking to integrate data from any form of on-street asset, whether they be sensors, cameras, parking machines, virtual session data, and they're all in the hope of providing customers a view of parking availability, where we use one of our products called Merge, which can layer all sources of parking of data to provide a live view of curbside usage and occupancy, and can, through data analytics, provide predictive information to help customers understand the likely space availability on the curbside, which will help considerably with journey planning. Within this program, we are extending this to include the data around EV charging locations, both on and off street, and their availability to drivers who will need to access a charge point on completion of their journey. We can present live data and predictive information based on analysis of trends to drivers through our mobility companion apps, helping appease any range anxiety for a driver who needs to charge when they consider using an EV for a vehicle. Moving on, thanks again to the BPA for the opportunity to introduce what I'm sure will be an interesting and informative session. I'd like to commend Karen Becks for preparing the session and the opportunity to hear about the content, the preparation call, and the assembled panelists are true subject matter experts in this field, and from whom we will undoubtedly learn a significant amount. My last responsibility is to say I hope everyone enjoys the session and introduce Matt Weston MP, who is the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Electric Vehicles. Matt is currently challenging government for a meaningful debate on the investment required for EV infrastructure. Thank you, and I'll pass over to Matt.
Well, thank you, Trevor. It's a real pleasure to join the conference today. Many thanks to the British Parking Association for arranging this two-day conference, and specifically to have this session now, the Evolve session, to really look at the huge opportunities I think that there are out there with the adoption of electric vehicles into the marketplace. Just a little bit of background, I arrived in Parliament in 2017. I was clearly not fresh out of graduate school, and I spent 24 years in the automotive industry before coming here. And I have become the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Electric Vehicles, but I'm also the chair of the All-Party Motoring Group, as well as the secretary to the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Cycling. And I just say that because they're cross-party groups that really present the case for different sectors in Parliament and make sure the voices are heard of those sectors. So that's just a little bit of background. Now, I think the opportunity is incredibly exciting for the sector because of the changes that are going on in society, the changes that can be brought about with the new energies, new alternative forms of transport. And I think that there is, for the first time in many decades, the chance to really challenge the established dominance of the petrochemical companies, the oil companies, and actually introduce alternative forms of powering and locations of power to people's personal mobility. Now, I just want to give some thoughts and overview really of how I see the market and so on. Clearly, this has all been brought about by addressing the need to address climate change. You'll perhaps be aware that we're way behind in meeting the fourth carbon budget, and that transport emissions are chief amongst the problem, remaining stubbornly high at 27%. That's where they've been for about a decade now, whilst domestic and industrial carbon dioxide emissions have been reducing dramatically. Now, the move to electric vehicles and hybrids has actually been very slow. In the early 2010s, just to quote some numbers, we had 25,000 new plug-in cars being registered per year, and it accounted for about 1% of the total car market. We're now looking at about 300,000 plug-in vehicles actually on the road. But perhaps more excitingly, in the last 12 months, we've seen electric vehicle registrations, passenger car registrations, double since 2019. Now, you'll also be aware that there are significant challenges to the adoption of electric vehicle. The early adopters are out there, but there is sort of mass concern really about this. And we've seen this from the report by the Committee for Climate Change. The consumer is obviously concerned about the purchase price. You see the purchase price perhaps being typically at least £5,000 more than the equivalent petrol vehicle. There's concern about confidence and where people will may be able to get the vehicle charged. And then there's this sort of lack of knowledge and uncertainty about the product and the technical side of it, which is, I think, holding back a lot of consumers as well. But just to come back to the charging points, which of course is particularly relevant to this session, and that is that we have 19,000 on-street charging points currently, of which 3,000 are rapid. But the Committee for Climate Change that I was just referencing earlier said that we need to get to 29,000 charging points by 2030, and 85% of those are going to need to be rapid charging points. Now, talking to consumers, talking to manufacturers, talking to energy companies, there is a widespread view that we can't just have sufficient, we need to actually oversupply into the market, because then only then will people be more ready to adopt electric vehicles. They need greater confidence to make that leap to trying electric vehicles, or perhaps hybrid vehicles, which of course is the halfway point to get there. Now, part of the uncertainty I was talking about a moment ago is, of course, where government is taking us. And from saying perhaps we want to get to zero carbon, or rather zero emission vehicles by 2040, government's now talking about 2035, but there are also noises about possibly being 2032. So we need clarity, I think, for the industry and certainly for the consumer and for you as investors in this sector. Now, I think electric vehicles need to be cheaper, but not just in purchase price. I think the argument has to be made about the whole life cost of running an electric vehicle. It's something that personally I'm entertaining myself. I've got an electric charge point in the garage. I'm lucky to have a garage at the side of our little coach house. But it's one of those things that, you know, when the price is right, then I will switch to it. But I think that people need to start changing their horizons and be considering the ownership of the vehicle for longer than, say, the typical 3 years that maybe some people have done in the past, certainly from buying new. But we need the tax breaks. We need free or reduced parking charges to help them, subsidized by central government. This sort of thing, of course, is being done by Norway and other countries who've shown very strong leadership in this. And we need the supermarkets and the other sort of parking facilities, particularly in workplaces, to be able to provide for this. And critical to the whole market is to ensure that there is interoperability so that the consumer isn't tied in any way. And that is one of the feedbacks that comes back from consumers. Battery technology is rapidly improving. We need to make batteries in the UK. I want to see a battery factory in Coventry, but we've estimated that we need about 4 gigafactories across the UK if we are going to meet demand, future demand, and actually protect our manufacturing sector here as well. But of course, there's a huge opportunity for government and local authorities to show leadership in this through their use of their own fleets, but also public sector utilities as well. Sorry, public sector or utilities as well. And British Gas, of course, have just announced a big deal for electric vans. Now, I think the signs are there. I think there's huge investment going into it from US companies, funds, and so on. And globally, you know, we've seen a 5-fold increase in the number of electric vehicles sold between 2015 and 2019. The trend is absolutely there. As someone, as I said, who worked in the automotive industry, back in the early 2000s, you track the data of diesel adoption and how people said diesel will never grow. It'll always be about 20%. Suddenly, it became 50% of the overall market. And I think we're going to see that replicated in the adoption of electric vehicles as well. And of course, this is something that will only be helped by getting more consumers more confident. As I say, I went to an event organized by the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders about 2 weeks ago. It was a drive event at a test track, had lots of different vehicles out there, and it was brilliant. You know, getting in it, and you are absolutely immediately converted to the superiority, really, of an electric vehicle over petrol or diesel. So those sorts of things can make a massive difference. The manufacturers are doing a great deal, electrifying many of the models, if not most of the models, by 2022. So the consumer choice is going to be out there. But I would really urge that local authorities and the car park operators collaborate on this. As I say, we have petrol stations out there, fuel stations, but here's an opportunity to have additional capacity delivered, and I think that's the fabulous and most exciting thing about this session, is about what can be done by working together for that. You know, we've got to get to zero carbon, and if ever there was a time, it is now. But we do need the certainty from government to help you and to help the consumer actually get to that. So thanks very much for inviting me along, and I hope those thoughts give you some perspective on where my thoughts are, and perhaps many of my colleagues as well. Can I now hand you over to Dan Brown, who's going to be chairing the panel session next. Dan.
Perfect. Thank you, Matt. That was extremely insightful and helpful. So to the conference today, welcome, welcome. Be you working from Berlin or Birmingham, Preston or London, whether or not you're in the office or in your living room, we have a fantastic session here for you today. So I'm just going to run through the speaker list and then I'll start making some introductions. But what we want to do is take some of the things that Matt's just identified, interoperability, the role of public services and local authorities in this transition, building consumer confidence. We want to explore those with each one of these different speakers here, because the prize for the UK as a country is it's there, right? It's gigafactories, it's a whole new supply chain, it's sort of centers of excellence. This is a real global race, and all the various different parts of the economy have different roles to play. So we'll hear from a range of different stakeholders here today. We'll start off with, of course, the most important perspective, which is the motorist perspective, right? And I'm really happy that we are starting with the consumer from the very, very beginning. So we'll hear from Neil Swanson, who's the director of the Electric Vehicle Association Scotland, which is representing drivers of EVs in Scotland. And he's going to address the view of EVs from the private motorist perspective. What's the opportunity? What are the issues? Then we'll move on to Fraser Crichton, who's Corporate Fleet Operations Manager over at Dundee City Council, who've done some brilliant work in developing sort of rapid charging hubs co-located with solar and storage. So Fraser's going to cover particularly the fleet perspective as well of electric vehicles. So I think that'll balance each other now quite nicely. Once we go from the motorists, we'll go to the legislation, because really, this is what's going to unlock investment in the infrastructure side. So we'll start with Robert Evans, who is the CEO of Cenex, which is a Centre of Excellence for Low Carbon and Fuel Cell Technologies. He's going to outline the policy story and where we're going. Then I'll pop in. I lead the EV work for the REA, which is the trade body that represents the renewable energy and clean tech sector. So we'll talk about some of the policy challenges more specifically that we're looking at. And then Tom Buck, who is CTO and Solutions Manager at Swarco, which is a manufacturer and a software provider, is going to take more of a look at the legislation from a practical, on-the-ground perspective and what this looks like. And finally, to tie things together, we're going to dive into infrastructure. So Phil Hack, Managing Director of EV Network, which is a major player in the EV sort of public charging space, is going to talk for a few minutes about what he's actually experiencing on the ground now that we've got the macro picture from Matt, the consumer perspective, and then the legislation perspective. And then we'll go over to Alan O'Donnell as well, who's Country Director at Easy, which is a brilliant smart charging manufacturer operating in the UK. So we hope each panelist will have 6 to 8 minutes to speak, that we'll be able to give you a really good, as a delegate, overview of what this sector is dealing with, what it looks like, what are the opportunities, what are we sort of grappling with. And then we'll go on to a break, and we'll have a proper discussion in some of the breakout sessions later in the afternoon. So there won't be too much Q&A with audience in this panel, but it is coming, don't worry. Let me see here. So I'm going to start off with Neil. Neil, take it away.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So, as Daniel says, my name is Neil Swanson. I'm one of the directors of EVA Scotland. As an association, we were actually formed back in about 2011 by our very own Magnificent Seven. And we exist to promote the electrification of transport across the whole spectrum, as well as providing a voice and support for users and switchers. We're actually actively involved with Transport Scotland, as well as active internationally as part of the Global EV Association Group. We are members of AVIA, the European Electromobility Association, working alongside organisations like Norsk Elbo-Forning, the Norwegian EV Association, and Plug in America. Today, I'm going to try and convey some of the views of private EV drivers. There are different models, work for different people. At the simplest level, drivers just want to charge. Particularly among early adopters, the mantra has always been that driving electric cars is as simple as ABC, always be charging. As cars see capacity grow, this is going to change and shift, especially for people who can charge at home, who most of the time will not need to charge out in public, long journeys being the obvious reason for doing so. However, for those with no access to home charging or constantly on the move, that ABC mantra will always remain true. Unlike ICE vehicles, EVs can be charged wherever they park. It's one of the big attractive features for them. So EV drivers do alter their parking to match charging. We hear that from our users all the time as they choose destinations. They often pick coffee and lunch spots that offer them charging and the scope to actually just relax while they refuel. It's a very different way of living. When it comes to that though, motorists are always looking for value, whether they're EV or ICE. So lower cost charging is always going to see a great deal of interest. Access to higher powered journey chargers is always going to be an option for people who have a time constraint, but most users will be better served and will seek out lower cost, slower charging. This is something we hear all the time, is people will drive out their way for saving a few pence on the cost per kilowatt hour. Added benefit of using that type of charging, the slower charging at alternate costs, is it does help keep down the cost of infrastructure and in the long term electricity on the whole market. This is something many users amongst the early adopters have a clear understanding of, with their transition to EVs often driven by an environmental standpoint. And already with the early majority, which we're seeing now with the new benefit in kind regime as a different approach from drivers, they don't really get the etiquette part of it. And part of that is free energy is too easy a target. It's something that alters behavior, and it isn't a helpful state of affairs. So what do users want? Overall, they want accessible low-cost charging. They want sufficient infrastructure to be sure that when they arrive, there will be availability. They want it to be easy and reliable. And above all, with EVs, they want it to be where they are actually going to be. No special journeys for fueling if they can at all avoid it. They want fairly universal availability at a variety of power levels with transparent tariffs based around the power kilowatts that are available and billed by the energy delivered in kilowatt hours. No complex tariffs, just a simple, seamless, faultless service from the charging infrastructure. Now, we see the various networks gradually evolving towards this, with growth in roaming services between networks, reducing the complexity of making long journeys. One card will rule them all. It's very Lord of the Rings. Instead of one ring, one card to rule them all. And the next generation of services that will come along will be things like plug and charge from the CCS Charing Group, where the car itself will manage the transaction between the charge point and the user's account. The next generation on that is wireless charging, where you will literally just stop, run away, and everything happens in the background. Contactless payment has obviously been rolled out across a large amount of the charger fleet at the journey charger level, which is ideal for occasional users, those who generally aren't going far from home. There are some key value-added services that will benefit consumers and operators coming from the smart charging and V2G arenas, which will help keep prices lower, and it also actively involves the drivers in how things are going to work for the charging and the grid. They might not be interested in why, but by having price points that tell them what it achieves, then we can engage them. And that's something that we've been conscious of and repeated over the last few years. We really need to get the users on board, because it is the holistic view. You've got to look at the whole picture. So users want to be able to charge wherever they are, at home, where you can, at the shops, cinema, gym, park and ride, or any visitor attraction. For many drivers just now, the availability of charging influences journey choices, and they want to be charging in secure, well-lit areas, and accessibility is obviously key. Irrespective of power levels, they want some sort of amenity nearby. It might just be a toilet or refreshments, or even just somewhere safe to go and walk and stretch their legs. We've offered, based on our users' feedback, a number of guides. The one we have with Orkney Renewable Energy Foundation on infrastructure design is quite useful, and we also offer a tariff guide. The key takeaway is high availability and how we support people who do not have access to home charging. And we need to do it at a price that guarantees some sort of equitable access. Obviously, if you can't charge at home, you will pay more for energy, and it's a challenge. Users also want more choice of vehicles, and we're seeing that rolling out now. And in terms of opening up the market, as you may have seen in the press, we've recently welcomed the Scottish Government's introduction of interest-free second-hand EV loans, which is doing part of what Matt just talked about there, opening up the market to a group of people who otherwise can't afford the expensive newer cars. we note that the total cost of ownership of an EV is markedly lower than the equivalent ICE in most cases. And we also believe that ownership models will shift over the next decade or so, but that's going to be discussion for another day. So really, availability of charging is key.
Perfect. Thank you, Neil. That was extremely insightful, particularly, faultless service, availability, ABC, always be charging. I think these are all absolutely crucial themes here. I think we're going to go now to Fraser. Fraser with Dundee City Council. I'll leave the floor to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me here. The first thing I would say is that I have been involved with electric vehicles and infrastructure for now 10 years. So to try and describe all the different elements of that in 6 minutes is quite difficult, but I'll go for a huge generalization of what's been happening, and hopefully people can pick certain bits out of it and certainly come back to me in later on discussions today. Starting off quite quickly, why Dundee? Why have I been developing our air quality in the city from the very beginning? Because of the compact nature of the city, the topography, its air quality issues are extreme, shall we say. So from the very beginning, we looked at transportation 10 years ago, right at the time when Nissan were developing or bringing to the market the Nissan Leaf. And from then on, it's developed. Another point is strong leadership. We've had strong leadership in the city, a very young, dynamic leadership that from the very beginning were proactive, and I was always given the backing when we were involved in transforming to e-mobility. So way back then, 10 years ago, what did we look at? We actually split, and we're talking about earlier on what I was going to talk about, which was fleets. So there was sort of 3 different categories when we decided that rather than just looking at this as a fleet from the council viewpoint, how do we actually develop a whole city and a whole region going forward? What was a 10, 15-year plan of adopting electric vehicles? So we split it down into the public sector, including my fleet, over 1,000 vehicles, NHS, university, police, depot charging. How do you then increase that? We're sitting at about 25% of that 1,000 vehicles are all pure electric. Then another area was how do we get businesses in Dundee and the local area, especially taxis, huge polluters in the city, to adopt. And then the final one, well, I should have put this probably for Neil, is the public. So those were the 3 distinct sort of sectors that we targeted, and then we had to understand what infrastructure did they require, because there's, one model won't fit all. Before I start about talking about infrastructure, the key element to all this is the energy. How much energy you need? Do you have it? Where you're putting it? Where you want it, etc. That's the key to developing all this infrastructure. So quickly, when we look at the city, so all cities and regions will be different, but Dundee, 51% of the population do not have private parking, and they live in tenements. So we couldn't develop charge infrastructure there. The taxis are not going to go home to get a charge because they're not going to make much money. So therefore, we developed what we saw and a small, well, from the very beginning in Oslo in Norway, was charging hubs. So presently, we have 3 charging hubs across the city. We're building a 4th one, and there's a fifth one going on later next year. In those hubs, we've got rapid chargers, 6 50-kilowatt rapid chargers, and then some slow. That is with solar canopies and battery storage as part of them. And key to that was engagement with the public, the taxi industry, where do we want to put them, looking at access routes, etc. So that's been very successful. Usage on those 3 hubs last year was well over 100,000 charging sessions, to put this into context. And right now, 25% of our taxi industry are pure electric. So it's been a huge success. So then moving on, we quickly realized that we're not actually just talking about putting charging infrastructure just for the vehicles. We can also adapt this to where we want the movement in the city of the vehicles going forward. Where do we want to put our charging infrastructure? Because that's where our cars are going to be, looking at the whole city, looking at low emission zones, etc. So we then started building infrastructure into our multi-storey car parks. And again, targeting those car parks, because that was where we wanted to put the vehicles in the future. And then what we're going to do after that was then develop a charging and parking app. So develop the two together, not look at them in silos, look at the actual positioning of a driver going into the city centre, giving them the option of doing both at the same time, booking like a credit. So it was sort of combining things together. Every time I think in Dundee we're doing so well, we're getting electric bin lorries, we're getting electric buses, everything's happening. I meet a gentleman called Tom, who's going to be speaking in about 20 minutes. And I look smugly at him and go, look what we've done. And then Tom tells me, oh, but have you thought of this? And this is what's happening. So throughout all this that I'm talking about, the industry, the technology is constantly developing. And we've got to keep up with that and understand that all these things actually integrate together. But what I'd like to think is in Dundee, what we've done is we've built the foundations with this infrastructure and the communication with our public, which is key to constantly keep saying, what do you want? Where do you need? And is this it? And getting that feedback. So all this bits of metal we're putting in, all this solar that we're putting in, they actually don't talk to you. They're not the key to this. It's always people. And I'll just end by saying all this infrastructure that we've built, because I know that the whole country's grappling with this. A key element to this is getting the right partner. I will do a little plug only because it's been so successful, is that we use a company called Swarco, and it's not, we don't speak to them on the phone every 6 months. We constantly speak to them because you've got to get this infrastructure right for Neil, who was talking on earlier, because you can imagine if the charging infrastructure in this city goes down, the taxi industry are on the phone within 2 seconds. So really what I would say to you is anybody thinking about getting involved in EVs, putting infrastructure, get the right partners and make sure that those people are there for the long run. That's me finished. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you, Fraser. And we'll be hearing from Tom at Swarco in about 3 presentations from now as well. That was a ringing endorsement. All right, so we're going to carry on now. So we've had a nice sort of look at the consumer side. And just to wrap that up, I'm just going to ask one quick question of both Neil and Fraser, if that's okay. So it's sort of in 30 seconds. You know, and particularly for Neil here, you know, I've done a bit of work with your guys' organization in the past. I understand there's sort of 3 types of drivers. It's sort of the ones that are just brand new and they're just trying to figure out, what is this thing? How do I buy my car? How do I get a charge point? There's the people that are normally driving and sort of gotten into it. And then there's sort of the evangelists, right? Who are at every single event and they're on social media and they just genuinely love this thing and they're part of sort of the EV army that's out there. But for Neil, for those first 2 groups, probably what's the top question that you get as an association from your members? And then Fraser as well, what's the top question you get from your the EV drivers within your fleet?
The number one is, how far can I go? And the answer we give is, how far do you want to go? It's that far. We can point out to people like Chris Ramsey, of Plug-in Adventures, who's driven to Ullanude in a 30 kilowatt-hour Nissan Leaf, so 10,000 miles in one trip, effectively, not a single drive, obviously. So you can go anywhere. The next one is always, where can I charge? And the answer to that is we point them at the apps like PlugShare, ZapMap, go and look at the Charge Place Scotland map. And they are always shocked by how much they see, especially when they look at Fraser and Dundee and they can't get over how many dots appear on the map at Dundee.
Perfect. And Fraser, the question to you?
They're varied. I think they're very quick. I mean, obviously we're in a different situation in Dundee because we've got so much charging infrastructure. But I think that we shouldn't underestimate the fact that people are going to have to change some of the way that they travel, etc., and use a vehicle in the future. And I think we shouldn't. So one of the questions I constantly get, which is probably apt to something Neil just said there, was, do I need to carry a can of electricity if I run out of electricity? And that's the change. When you think in your head, do you actually get what they're trying to think? They're saying, well, I've normally got a petrol can, now do I need an electricity can? So there's a long way to go to get people to so I'll go back to it. It might sound boring, but communicating, telling people the EV Association is key to this, getting their campaign out, us as a council, and it's just communicating, because we get everything from left field to what if I put my fingers in the charger? Well, you know what, it's not going to be a good result.
No.
All right. Well, that really nicely frames the policy and the infrastructure questions coming up now. So I'm going to share my screen and hand over to Robert Evans, CEO at Cenex. Is everybody seeing?
Yeah, we can see that, Daniel.
Perfect. Fire away, Robert.
Robert, you're muted.
Sorry about that, folks. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. So Cenex, we're a consultancy and research organization that's been sort of 15 years in the space, and it's been a pleasure and a privilege to be part of this e-mobility journey that is still in its early phases, 15 years on from the start, as it were. The policy drivers are pretty well established and have been touched on already in terms of tackling climate change, the desire for clean air, and has also been referenced by Matt at the beginning. It's also about employment and jobs. I've borrowed a sort of advert from a very important political, an influential political advert that occurred in the 70s that was responsible for knocking one government out. It really is that there is a big role here in employment. You know, we make in the UK 2.7 million engines, and we employ about 850,000 people directly in our motor industry. And if we are going to move away from 2.7 million engines, we need to be making 2.7 million of something else, whether that's batteries, electric motors, all of the components and systems that go in this next generation of electric vehicles. So there's a message really on the policy side. I'm showing some angry people, or some people who might be quite angry if their jobs no longer exist. Is really that the policymakers have been aware often before the general public cares. But once the general public cares, the politicians best beware. And I think that reflects the kind of thinking that is driving, for example, in the last political manifestos for the last parliament, the push for gigafactories and the push for quite demanding targets for EV adoption. Next slide, please, Daniel. So the UK has made a commitment. Initially, it was looking around banning petrol and diesel cars from 2040. Then it moved it to 2035. Now it's consulting, and that could be moved to 2032. And environmental groups are looking at a ban on petrol and diesel cars by 2030. So this chart shows the sort of effect. On the left-hand side is what this means in car sales. So if we take the blue, darker blue line, not the dotted one, that's looking at a ban of petrol and diesel cars by 2035. And that's the sales are on the left, and that corresponds to the green line on the right of total, which is the number of number of EVs as a percentage of vehicles on the road, or rather as a percentage of vehicles parked, since vehicles 80% or plus of the time are parked. It gives that effect. So if I put it in numbers, in order to get towards a banning of petrol and diesel cars by 2035, you need to have made progress very much more quickly than that. And so what we've got from Matt referenced 300,000 cars on the road currently. It'll be under this chart, it'll be 1.6 million by 2020. 2025. By 2030, it would be 10 million EVs on the road. And by 2035, that's 21 million EVs. Now, all those EVs are going to be charging at some point, whether it's once a week or once a day. So that's a considerable requirement for EV charging to achieve these targets. Next slide, please. So there's three phases I really want to talk about. We're currently still within what I would consider to be the seeding phase, where government policy in terms of some carrots, incentives that Daniel will talk to, is very much playing out. And it's really been about this underdeveloped market that needs government assistance and support to get started. And we've kind of been learning 5 important things in this seeding phase. We've been, as has been referenced by Neil, we've been learning what the EV motorists want. We've been learning about what types of infrastructure best go where, and I think this will be explored by the speakers later on. We've been learning about the business models for those that own and operate EV charging, and which are the business models that are going to fly and which are the business models that might struggle. For example, EV car clubs has struggled, whereas charging on the motorway network has been a successful business model. Then we've also been learning how local authorities work best with the private sector, and Fraser has touched on this in his presentation. And finally, we've been learning about barriers to the uptake of EVs, whether they're the motorist barriers, but more particularly to do with the transport system or the energy system. Is how does the energy system need to adapt to a world where 21 million electric vehicles are being charged once a week or once a day, or with those kind of levels of frequency being charged in public locations as well as private locations. So next slide, please. So we move from the learning phase then to the mass adoption phase, and this is where you get this inflection from the kind of 1.6 million to 10 million to 21 million EVs on the UK roads. And at this stage, government policy doesn't need to have incentives. And in fact, government wouldn't be able to afford to pay everyone £5,000 to buy a new EV. At this stage, the market should have taken over, and government's role is just to make sure that progress is being achieved and all barriers and impediments to market forces are out of the way. And the next slide, please, Daniel. And then the final part will be the end game, where government starts to step in and start to use more sticks and get more regulatory in its approach to make sure it can achieve its end target. Next slide, please. So, overall in the policy aims for EV charging, from a policy perspective, government will look first and foremost to aid the consumer, or to make sure that the consumer interests are taken into account. So for the EV motorists, as Neil has referenced, it's incredibly important that there's a widely accessible network of charge points. And that can involve, although there are many different operators, the idea that you could roam between the networks relatively easy, so they're interoperable. So whether you come with a card, a membership of one particular scheme, a mobile phone means of accessing, or whether you go with your credit card and chip and pin payment, you want to be able to access this estate of charge points, not find yourself islanded and only able to use a limited number. They need to be affordable, so government policy aims needs to make sure that the pence per kilowatt hour for charging electric vehicle on the public network is a fair and equitable price, and there's no one profiteering in that space. And then equitable. This is kind of important, so that EV charging is not just for the richer in the community, and it doesn't. It's one of those situations where it is more readily available for all parts of the community. And this, in a policy terms, has been particularly relevant, for example, in rural areas. So the ZAP map shows here of the UK plastered with charge point access everywhere, but there's a bit of white there up in the rural area of Scotland, and there's a question mark about who is going to support what might be more of a public service in terms of charge points on strategic road networks in rural areas where they don't get the economic usage that they would do in urban areas. So these factors, the accessibility also relates, I think, to a situation at the moment. Maybe the concern is range anxiety. In that mass adoption phase, the concern can be queuing anxiety. So you can get to a charge point, but if you are in a queue for that, that would be deemed to be very problematic. So these are factors to take into account policy-wise. But also from the policymaker's perspective, it all has to be economically sustainable. To achieve that middle phase of mass market adoption, there has to be financial business models that work for the owners and operators of charge points within the electric vehicle supply equipment sector. And this relates to the parking sector. So for those of you in parking, owning and operating EV charging needs to be an economic proposition that you want to invest in as part of your facilities, such that you don't miss out, that EV motorists don't avoid your locations, but also that you can earn money from EV charging as a contributor to your income. And hopefully these are the kind of themes that I've touched on that will be explored further by the other speakers. So I'll stop here. I'll hand over to Daniel, and I know that Daniel will pick up on some of the more immediate elements of the policy that's available now. And I think that Tom will also pick up on the lessons being learned in this seeding phase in terms of what kind of works where, and how that learning can be transferred through to the parking sector.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Robert. So I'll just touch a couple of points here. So strengths and weaknesses of where we're at the moment. So we've got the consumer view, we've got Robert Evans, where are we going? What's the end game here? But at the end of the day, we're always living in the now, or apparently we should be. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of the situation we have today? So just a little bit of background, we're the UK's trade association. We largest trade association for renewable energy and clean technologies. Our EV forum is about 80 different members operating across the EV infrastructure value chain, from installers to charge point operators to service providers, payments platforms. We talk to government a great deal about infrastructure, about payments, about sort of grants, about grid connection processes and costs. Yeah, we're usually the ones trying to work collaboratively or getting a bit annoyed that the whole thing isn't moving fast enough. But there is a lot that we're getting right, and I want to start with this, right? The government's done a really good job in putting together grants for homes, for workplaces, and for on-street charging points. The on-street grant as well is something that local authorities can access and covers 75% of the cost of an installation of an on-street charging point, right? So we do have these schemes. We've got a big qualified installer base. The installers, you can't, they're everywhere, and you can't get enough of them at the moment. And there's all sorts of new products that are moving into the space to make sure that they have the equipment where they need it, and it's all being quite a bit more standardized than it has been in the past. This installer base is going to have to expand. A recent survey by the Electrical Contractors Association noted that 70% are a bit nervous about getting the skills they need for ramp up. But as of today, we do have this big qualified base of people to put kit in the ground, which is great. A lot of which have actually come out of the solar and storage industries as well. We've got a shifting focus from government. So far they've really focused homework, but now they're really moving towards the public charging side. They set aside in the last budget £500 million in this fund called the Rapid Charging Fund. This is designed to be targeting grid upgrades along the strategic road network and the major A roads in England, so that big rapid charging hubs can be developed. They're targeting 6,000 ultra-rapid chargers, so 150 to 350 kilowatts, by 2035, which is a big piece of work. And frankly, 500 million might not be enough to cover that. But they are focusing now on sort of how do we provide that mass confidence along the main roads. And then the Welsh government and the Scottish government are looking very closely and rolling out similar tenders. Finally, we are building our own charging infrastructure value chain. There's a lot of jobs coming out of the charging infrastructure side at the moment. There's a lot of people being employed. So My Energy and EO Charging are two British charging companies that manufacture everything here, which is great. Swarco, we're about to hear from in a little bit. All the software is developed here. ChargePoint, big multinational American company, I think the biggest charging company in the world, they're building a testing and training facility here and employing local staff. So no matter where you are, we have a lot of IP in this sector, and it's a really good thing to keep growing. However, we're not quite there yet. There's a few areas we have to work on. So in particular, apartment blocks, there's no particular grant, or there's very, very unclear support for apartment blocks. How does that money get distributed? And this is something that we know the Office for Low Emission Vehicles is looking at. But I think on a more wider note, there is an opacity in the role for local authorities in this whole transition. It hasn't been clearly communicated what your guys' role is. OLEV are developing an EV infrastructure strategy in the next year, which hopefully will help clarify that. But it's one thing to say, okay, here's a little bit of on-street money for some on-street chargers, but it's another thing to clearly say, okay, this is what we're hoping for you guys to deliver, and then fingers crossed, here's a pot of money for you guys to be doing training, developing low carbon transport strategies, and even developing local authority tenders for charging infrastructure, where as the association, this is what we're calling for, and this is where we hope the direction of travel is. Other areas that we still need to nail down, smart charging. So we still don't have confirmed standards or legislation in this space. It's coming, but we still don't have agreed upon standards within the industry, but we are moving that way in the next year. Building regulations, new builds, new homes, new commercial properties. We haven't had clarity from government about what that's going to look like. They're doing a big review of building regulations, but we know that all new homes are going to need some sort of charging infrastructure installed. And it's been over a year since they've consulted on this, but we don't know exactly what they plan to do yet. So we're moving in the right direction, but it's still a big policy question. And then the final one, as sort of was mentioned by Neil and Matt, interoperability. And this is for charging points to be able to communicate with each other and communicate between different back offices. And this is a big, big problem. And this is something that I spend a lot of time on. And what this means for drivers and the parking sector is payments. How do we standardize payments and make it super easy? I was talking to the Norwegian Electric Vehicle Association the other day, and they have 75,000 EV drivers that are members. They take 4,000 emails a month and 1,000 calls a month from their members about charging, and most of that is relating to payments and ease of payments, right? This is a huge, huge area, but the government is going to consult on standardizing this whole space, making it easier to pay, and roaming is the topic of the day. It's the buzzword of the day. How do you make sure that your membership for one charging network lands well on another charging network, and one card essentially integrates with the rest? But I will stop speaking now. We've got lots of time for discussion in later sessions, and I will move over to Tom.
Right, I remembered to unmute. Thank you, Daniel. Conscious of time, so we'll crack on here. Oh, there's a. Can we go back one slide? Sorry, there's possibly some. No, is it automatically? Right,
nope.
okay.
I think that's the one we're starting on, sorry.
Yeah. So my premise is this. First of all, I haven't spoken at a lot of parking in conferences about e-mobility, but I've done a lot of e-mobility conferences where I've talked about parking. My premise is that the parking industry is the industry that can really trigger the move to mass adoption. I think you might have to back it, Daniel. I think we've got a...
Are we multiple people? There we go. How's that?
Yeah, you might just have to watch it because I think there might be some embedded transition, so I apologise for that. All right. So why is the parking industry so important, and how can it help meet the challenges we've heard about already? Well, some very obvious reasons. We as an industry have the most easily accessible, truly national stock of potential public charging sites. There's over 20,000 public car parks already, and to this we can add our workplace and private parking stock. The sites are already at locations directly linked to quality of life and economic growth, education, employment, healthcare, leisure, retail, tourism, logistics, and of course new markets and extended labour pools. The second key factor, which is the one that's on the screen right now, is that the personal transport in the form of the car, and that means electric or anything else, is likely to remain a critical part of our transport infrastructure. This is particularly important when you include the national need to provide opportunities for both urban and rural communities. And today, not having a car, having access to a car, is seen as a barrier for employment, training, and further education. The statistics have been that 44% of households where people are out of work have no access to a car in any form. Next slide, please. So even in our major urban conurbations, where public transport services are regular, reliable and comprehensive, personal transport is still a major component in the journey chain. On the right-hand side, you can see the figures that came from London TfL. And as an environmental reality, the drive to get the public to think about alternative journey chains and modal shift relies on strong public transport services. I would suggest that even before COVID, the funding levels needed to provide suitable alternatives to the car wasn't going to change the mass view. And COVID has left our public transport network reeling as the public return to cars, which in some areas is good news for the electric car. And why is this? Next slide, please. Real world human behavior. These are the national travel statistics. I'm going to come back to this in a second or so, but please just make a note of them. 70% of the trips we do, whatever we think, are the same. 95% of those trips are under 25 miles, and only 2% extra are under 50. That makes these big motorway journeys really quite a small component of the real world. And then we can tie this now with, next slide, with the real world use case. This is a map of England and Wales. It's a Government Department of Transport image. It's from 2016, but it's still sort of relatively relevant for the concept. They map the number of employment centres you can get to by public transport on the left-hand side, and that's within 45 minutes or 35 miles. If we then add this slide that's come in, you can see that we can look at the number of opportunities that people can access by car. So electric vehicles will not alter access to jobs or block wealth creation. And if we remember that 70% of trips are the same, 95% of those trips are less than 25 miles, and 2% of those trips are more than 50 miles, you can see that 90% of workers, employees, can go full electric, and they can do it based on AC charging. Next slide, please. Next slide, Daniel. Sorry, yes. So parking, oh, back one. Right, so parking and e-mobility. So we're going to now take a look at making charging infrastructure accessible to where people really need it. The first point I'd like to make, which is the next slide, is that it's not new. We've had electric motors since 1821. The first electric car went faster than 100 kilometers an hour in 1899. And I think if you interviewed this lady today, you'd find the same concerns. She needed to feel safe and secure in terms of range and queue anxiety. Will I have access to a charger? Can I access charging at any time and anywhere? I need easy access to that charging infrastructure. I don't want to be locked out by membership schemes or have to fight my way through security doors and so on. And really, drivers want the same experience as today. When I go to a fuel station, I just choose diesel or petrol, plug it in and go. But also that question about the right charging infrastructure, its reliability and its accessibility. Open for use to as many people as possible and really connected to journey time and route planning. Next slide. Next, Daniel. So yeah, so even so, the focus hasn't always been on real world needs. We've heard about charging at home. In the early days, it was 80% of charging will take place at home. But in reality, however, it's very different. If we want to get mass adoption, and only a privileged few can truly rely on home charging to meet their needs. On-street charging isn't the most effective way of delivering infrastructure. Certainly not if we want a real shift in the number of electric vehicles on our roads. Local authority policies have targeted reduction in street furniture. Street lighting circuits are not the most reliable source of power. They're delivered as single phase, and then there's a clash over responsibility. If the lights fail, who's going to fix them and why did they fail? We have to deal with legislation. We have to deal with enforcement, and we have to make guarantees. Oh, sorry, it's very difficult to provide a guarantee that availability of those charging points will need. This is just not a problem the UK faces. I was involved in the preparation of the European roadmap entitled Electrification of Road Transport, where the following observations were made. In the short to medium term, urban and suburban transport will be the major application for the future of battery electric vehicles. We need to provide appropriate charging options to urban dwellers. Relying on overnight street parking and limited garage space in high density populated areas is a problem. And public authorities have a long-term aim to reduce the number of vehicles in cities. And there's a reluctance to electrify high numbers of parking spaces with bulky and unsightly charging stations that do not fit easily into the townscape. Next slide, please. So let's come back to that original premise that the parking industry is the industry that can really trigger the move to mass adoption in e-mobility. We as an industry have a lot to offer. We have accessible, safe and secure parking at pretty much every destination people want to visit. The length of stay in off-street car parks closely matches optimum charging times, 2.5 hours or 7 hours for season cards and employee parking. We have a huge range of supporting technologies that naturally lend themselves to electric car drivers, from payment, booking and reservations to find and navigate your way to a parking place or charging stations. They exist today. We decide what is included in tenders for equipment and services we want our car parks to offer. We have the people, the skills and the connections that can influence and shape the direction we take. Yet there are some challenges. Existing car parks are effectively running on low voltage networks. We need to lobby to encourage these facilities to be upgraded to handle standard AC charging infrastructure to begin with. New car park builds should be encouraged to install power to support 7.5 kilowatts where possible. All equipment tenders should include requirements around electric vehicle charging. And in Hungary, it's now pretty much mandated to have an integrated solution or you cannot sell equipment. We have to make it inclusive. It has to be accessible to all. Flexible payment options, membership, tap and charge, combined payments by card or cash. It should become as the standard for drivers to enter car parks and be able to obtain combined parking charges with those incurred for e-mobility. Enforcement policies needs to be united. Procurement of charging infrastructure needs good, unbiased advice from independent organizations. And I think my final point was don't forget to devote a little time to the most fascinating document there is and is often forgotten, and that's the EU Directive on Alternative Fuels. It's hidden in there. The UK government have signed up to it. And if it's not easy to access a charger in your car park, potentially there are fines out there that can be applied. So in summary for me, without a doubt, the parking industry has the people, the skills and the connections to place the industry in a leading position to influence and shape the electrification of our national transport network going forward. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Tom. So we're on now to Phil and Alan from an infrastructure perspective. We've started a little bit late. We're going to go over a couple minutes, and so we're just going to go sort of 2 or 3 minutes into the break. So we'll just end the session rather than at 10 past, just a few minutes after that. Phil, do you want to get us started?
Yep. Hi guys. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Phil Hack. I'm the managing director of the EV Network. We are an investor in typically high-powered charging infrastructure across the UK. And 6 weeks ago, we announced our first 50 million of investment ready to be deployed in charging infrastructure. So when it comes to infrastructure, from a car park operator, and that's both commercial or a local authority car park, the first thing to think about before you even consider installing chargers is, what is my future plan for that car park? If you've got any plans to redevelop the site, make it bigger or even smaller, over the next 5 to 10 years, you should really give some careful consideration. This infrastructure is expensive, typically, particularly if you're looking at high power charging or rapid charging. So before you do anything, just understand both the ambition for the site, but also what arrangements you might have in terms of lease or freehold. If an organisation could easily spend £50,000 to £100,000 in creating capacity on that site, you've just increased the value of that land for the ultimate landlord. So if you're going to start investing in infrastructure, make sure you've got long security on that site, because the risk is when it comes for renewal, it may cost you a lot more than you hoped. In terms of charges, and you guys know this better than anyone, that is, what are the current dwell times of that particular car park? Is that a short stay offering? Is it mid-stay, or is it for train stations or other sort of long-term transport needs? So that actually will start to dictate the sorts of charging infrastructure and charging that you would be appropriate for your site. So really understand and look at your data and tell you, how long are people staying. If people are staying for half an hour to an hour, it's quite a different charging solution for someone who's there for 8 hours. It's on a train or a major workplace. Think about it, it's been touched on today about what else are you trying to achieve. In our view, you shouldn't be just putting in charging for the sake of a provision of charging. Is it to try and change some other behaviours? So are you trying to encourage more walking? So perhaps you're targeting charging at the car parks, perhaps a mile from the city centre or a mile from the main sort of urban area. More cycling, so you're co-locating either electric bikes or bike hire schemes with the parking. Is it also to access public transport such as buses, trams, and trains, of course? And more interestingly, actually, it has been touched on, and that is, what else can you do with your car park? It may be more aligned to commercial, but I think equally important to local authority car parks, and that is around this concept of stopping vans and cars going into the city centres and actually creating these last mile logistics hubs where actually you have a provision in the car park for trucks to be effectively decanted into either cycling or walking routes or smaller electric vans themselves. So really understanding what else, or what is your, as a local authority, what else are you trying to achieve through the electrification charging facility car parks. And not to mention actually taxis. Someone's mentioned taxis already. And that is, if a local authority has an ambition to, I don't know, any new licenses delivered by 2025 needs to be with an electric vehicle, then actually having a charging facility may also support driving that change for electric taxis. Most car parks, has been mentioned, low voltage connected, a few kilowatts, providing supplies for lighting, barriers, etc. If it's a multi-storey car park, you may have introduced LED lighting and massively reduced your demand for site, and you may have given that back to the DNO, and somebody else might have gobbled up that spare capacity. So actually, in a lot of cases, the existing supplies are very small at the site. So in most cases, you need to increase the capacity onto the site. Now, for people, that may seem quite strange that when you apply to the local distribution network company, and I spent 31 years working for a distribution company in the UK, you could get anything back. So we've applied for over 400 times, 400 applications to local distribution companies across the UK. Typically, we're asking for 1,000 kVA, or let's say 1,000 kilowatts of capacity at a site. That can vary from £40,000 to £4.4 million just on the location. So if there's spare capacity passing the site, then generally it's a lot lower cost than if they've got to dig up 2 kilometres of highway to bring in new 11,000 volt network into the site. So it can be extremely, there's no real answer to, is this site going to be a higher cost or lower cost? You need to go through that process. In most cases, the local distribution network company will offer you a budget estimate for a couple of £100 in terms of what you need on the site. Now, to determine exactly what you do need the site, there's lots of experts, many of them on this call will help you determine the capacity you need, but you need to decide yourselves what is the use case for your car park. Is it providing AC trickle charging for long dwell time events, or is it actually we're going to carve out not only trickle charging for the longer stay events, but within the car park itself, we're going to create a charging hub. So actually creating a location where actually parking isn't the primary objective of the visitor. The primary objective of the visitor is to come in and get a relatively easy, relatively fast charge in that car park. You know, good access to obviously the street, well signposted. I can get in there, I can spend 20 minutes on a high powered charger and be away. And then I guess the opportunity for the operator of that car park is, are we actually going to charge parking at all? Which, you know, may seem a bit weird when you're a car park operator, or actually are we receiving revenues through the charging event itself? So there are a number of business models available to the different car park operators. One could be you invest directly. You take all the asset risk, you take all the utilisation risk, and you hope people turn up. That's obviously one option and is expensive and sometimes take a while to get those projects away. The other is to rent or lease car parking bays or space within the car park and get a long-term revenue in terms of renting, and more increasingly renting and revenue share or renting and profit share. So we're actually, as the take-up of EV occurs, you can also get back some of that future value as well. I've done 6 minutes, so I'm going to stop there, but happy to answer any other questions.
Perfect. Thanks, Phil. And we'll have a proper session at the end for Q&A with delegates, and Phil and Ellen and others will all be very much on hand then as well. Ellen, over to yourself.
Hi, everyone. Saving the best till last, usually you would say, but I think it doesn't play in my favour going last here, because I think a lot of my thunder's been stolen by some very great points I've heard along the way. So I'm just diving through my notes here to strip out the ones, to find the ones that are still interesting to everyone on the call today and not repetitive. So I think the first one is there enough power to deploy EV charging? And for DC charging, for rapid charging, there is no myth. You need a huge power supply, and it's required. So the replication of petrol-style filling stations is needed to facilitate long journeys, but also so we can accelerate the adoption of EVs, as we've seen with the Tesla supercharger network. But when it comes to AC charging, needing power is a complete myth. So let me burst the myth for everyone on the call. We need to stop talking about power. It's not power you use to charge vehicles at AC charging. It's energy you use. So energy being the measure of power over time. So you don't need power, you need energy. And when you're looking at it from an energy perspective, you can look at it with a whole new vision. So the current UK model is to default to power upgrades, and I think Phil was speaking about that with some of his experiences with the power upgrades there. That's not the default, and it's certainly not scalable, and it's very expensive, as Phil said there. It's education, understanding the end use case, and setting the right expectations of the end users. So for car park operators on this call, I would say do not design buildings to have a minimum power rating of, let's say, 7 kilowatts per point. If you do that, you're strangling yourself for the amount of power and capacity you need. The best everyday example I can give you of that is the average new build home is built with a 2 kilowatt power supply. That's a kettle in your home. So if you were to allow 7 kilowatts for every charging point and take the same method to building houses, we would never build another house. So forget about a fixed power per point. Power is a measure of an instant measure of a current flow. It's not the measure of energy over time. So if we flip the conversation to energy, we're going to be able to accelerate this adoption very quickly. Interoperability. Tom Buck spoke about this. I know Matt Western kicked it off with interoperability. I'm a Nissan Leaf owner. I've went through all the pain points of cards, RFIDs, day on day of my life. I've also seen how good it can be. I was a Tesla employee for 5 years. I drove Teslas every day, and I experienced that customer experience that you get at the superchargers. However, superchargers are the opposite of what interoperability is. So interoperability, the word roaming has been mentioned a few times today. Roaming is an elastoplast to patch up the network and all the mistakes we've made today in the UK. Roaming is not the solution. With roaming, you need additional layers, you need clouds, you need back-end support, you need RFIDs, you need apps. These are all points of failure in the system. So they're good to patch things up and try and make good of what we've got. But the future for interoperability must be contactless payments, and it must be interoperable for the customer. And contactless payments, let's not recreate something here that already exists. Debit cards, credit cards, Apple Pay, Android Pay. So yeah, contactless is key as well. Next one there, I think, on interoperability is, let's say we're in the year 2025 now, and everything's perfect for the end user. It's all interoperable. They can turn up at any charge point publicly and charge their car with no hassle. Interoperability needs to be the same for the developers. And I feel the developers and the people that actually pay for the infrastructure don't have this. So whilst it's an open network or it's interoperable, the developer, whether it be a local authority like Fraser and Dundee, or a developer, like Robert, I think, who was talking earlier on, they're tied into long-term commercial agreements, so 5 to 10 year leases. So is it really interoperable? Is it really open if you're tied into long-term commercial agreements? So again, to accelerate this, I think we need shorter-term commercial agreements. It will improve competition and make people like local authorities make easier decisions when there's a less longer-term impact. How am I doing for time? 2 minutes? Quickly, 1 minute. Public, next generation of EV owners have been left behind. I was going to talk about Amsterdam. In Amsterdam, chargers were like this and cars were like this. Now they stopped. You look at a map of Amsterdam and it's only the affluent areas that have benefited from public funding. So we really need to look where this public money's been spending and make sure we facilitate EV charging for everyone, the next generation of EV owners, social housing, and giving them the chance to drive EV in the future. I was going to go on about learners from Norway, but I've not got time. So I'm just going to leave it from that. And yeah, I'll wait for the Q&A.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Alan. Thank you, everybody. And excitingly, a lot of the issues that we've talked here about today, about sort of maintenance, accessibility, how do you charge, access, Google Pay, Apple Pay, Android Pay, WhatsApp Pay in the future. It's all going to be consulted on by central government in December, November, somewhere in there. So there is a big piece of work that's coming. And this event and this panel and this collaboration that's coming forward could be a great, great group to be feeding into that consultation in a few weeks' time. I'm going to call it there for the panel, or we will see everybody back in a few minutes.
Just to support you on that, Daniel, absolutely fantastic session. My mind is boggling. I've been uplit here. The sunshine has come out and literally inspired in every single sense, including physically. We are conscious of time, but what we want to do is still allow you to have that 10-minute break. And so sorry, Alan, like you said, coming up the rear here, but we will have plenty of time in that wrap-up session. So there's so much good stuff yet to come. We want to give you everybody 10 minutes because we have got that crossover and we do want to make sure we don't lose any participants along the way. So it is currently 17 minutes past, according to my internet. It's 17 minutes past. If we start to get ourselves rallied again for 27 minutes past 3, we will then start the session at 3:30. And we just want to make sure you've got all the access links that you need. They're being posted in the chat again. Please reach out to us either via chat or the emails or membership at britishparking.co.uk. And we will do everything we can